The sun of New Mexico doesn't forgive. It scorches bone and dries the soul. Out there, a man either bends or breaks. And some men, like Zane Donovan, learned long ago that if you've already lost everything, the fire in the sky can't hurt you anymore. Zane had the look of a man carved from the very granite cliffs that towered over his land. Broad-shouldered, rugged, his beard shot with gray, his eyes carrying that haunted stillness of someone who had outlived too many memories. Folks in Copper Springs spoke his name in half-whispers, that reclusive rancher up in the high country, the one who rarely came down except for salt, bullets, or whiskey. They said he had once been a respected cattleman with a family and a future. They said the frontier had taken it all away. 15 years back, raiders had swept through his homestead, leaving nothing but ash and 2 graves beneath a cottonwood tree. His wife, Faye, and his daughter, Rose, gone in a night of fire and screams. Since then, Zane's ranch had withered to a shadow of itself. The barns leaned like old men, the corrals stood empty, and the cattle were few and skittish. What kept him alive wasn't money, nor land, nor hope. It was habit. Habit and the strange pull of these wild mountains that had swallowed his grief as their own. That morning, the land looked endless, painted in ochre and bronze. The dry wind carried the bitter scent of sage and dust, a reminder that even beauty here came with a price. Zane crouched low behind a boulder, his rifle steady, eyes fixed on a 6-point buck grazing in the clearing. He breathed slow, calm, every muscle disciplined. Hunting was one of the few things that still made sense, simple, fair, unforgiving. But just as his finger grazed the trigger, the wind carried something foreign. Voices. Distant, rising and falling like waves across the valley. The buck's ears twitched, and in a heartbeat it bounded into the brush, gone without a sound but the thud of hooves. Zane cursed under his breath, lowered his rifle, and pulled his battered field glasses from his saddlebag. Through the wavering heat, he spotted a gathering by the dry creek bed. 30, maybe more. Settlers, ranch hands, drifters, clustered in a rough circle, their hats casting long shadows. In the center stood a man in a black coat, tall and commanding, silver beard catching the sun. Judge Grimm. Even from this distance, Zane recognized him. Grimm was more than a lawman in Copper Springs, he was the law. His voice carried like iron, sharp and heavy, the evidence is irrefutable. Zane edged closer down the slope, his boots finding the quiet path of a man used to moving unseen. As the scene sharpened before him, he felt his jaw tighten. At the circle's heart, on her knees in the dirt, was a young Apache woman, Lark. Her dark hair tangled, her face streaked with dust and bruises. Rope bound her wrists cruelly, and though her body sagged, her eyes burned with defiance. Grimm paced before her like a preacher at a pulpit. She was caught red-handed, stealing documents from my office. Secrets that are not the concern of her kind. This, people of Copper Springs, is proof that savages cannot be trusted. His words rumbled through the crowd, met not with cheers but with a dangerous silence. Zane's stomach turned. He'd heard of Grimm's son-in-law, a relic of colonial cruelty, 3 days staked beneath the desert sky, no food, no water, left for heaven's judgment. Everyone knew it wasn't judgment. It was slow murder. For men stepped forward with iron stakes and hammers. The crowd parted, dust rising as they dragged Lark to a bare patch of ground where the sun beat down like God's own anvil. The hammer strikes echoed, cold, merciless, as they stretched her arms and legs wide, pinning her against the earth. Let the sun decide, Grimm declared, his voice swollen with authority. The people began to drift away, leaving the woman bound and trembling beneath the merciless sky. Zane lingered in the shadow of a juniper tree, fists clenched. He could walk away. He should walk away. That was the rule he'd lived by, don't get tangled in other folks' wars. But as he looked at her face, bruised yet unbroken, something shifted deep inside him. Something he hadn't felt in years. The mountains had taught him silence. But now, silence felt like cowardice. The desert has a way of stripping a soul bare. By noon, the air shimmered like molten glass, and every rock, every blade of grass, every bone-dry tree seemed to radiate heat. Out there, a man could feel his own blood cooking under his skin. And for someone bound to the earth with no shade, no water, no mercy, the desert was a death sentence. Zane stayed hidden in the slope above the creek bed, watching. He could have turned back. He should have. That was the smart choice, let Grimm's cruelty run its course and keep to his own lonely life. But his boots remained planted in the dust, his chest heavy as he looked at the Apache woman stretched out beneath the sky. Her name drifted through the whispers of the crowd before they'd left, Lark. Now, she lay flat, staked spread eagle, the coarse ropes biting deep into her wrists and ankles. The sun pressed down on her like a branding iron. Her lips had already cracked, bleeding at the corners. Sweat poured, only to vanish in the heat before it could darken the dirt beneath her. The Blackburn brothers, Vern and Hank, had set up camp on a rise overlooking the scene. They weren't just guards, they were vultures in human skin. Hard-eyed, leather-skinned, their laughter carried across the dry wash as they shared a bottle. Every so often, one of them would glance down at Lark, smirking like it was sport, not suffering. Zane's jaw worked tight. He'd seen death before, swift, brutal, merciless. But this slow torture stirred something different in him. He thought of Faye, his wife, and the way her people had once welcomed him despite the color of his skin. He thought of Rose, his little girl, laughing in the shade of the cottonwood tree before the fire took her. The memories struck sharp as cactus spines. He shifted his rifle against his shoulder, the temptation clawing at him. One well-placed shot, and either Blackburn brother would drop. But the other would sound the alarm, and soon Grimm's men would come swarming. Zane had lived long enough to know a single bullet could light a fire you couldn't stamp out. The hours dragged. The sun climbed higher. Lark's breathing turned shallow, ragged. She moved her head slightly, eyes half closed, lips parting to whisper something too faint for him to hear. Even from a distance, Zane could see the fire hadn't left her completely. Her gaze, though clouded, still carried a spark of defiance. By late afternoon, the land turned to an oven. Heat waves rolled off the ground in shimmering mirages. The air smelled of dust and despair. The Blackburns were drunk now, cards spread between them on a crate, their attention drifting. Zane eased back, retreating into the shelter of a juniper grove higher up the ridge. He built no fire, took no rest. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed on the faint figure below. The desert tested men, but what it was doing to her, it was no test. It was murder in plain sight. As the sky bled orange with the setting sun, the temperature fell as sharply as it had risen. The night wind carried a cruel chill. Zane moved quietly, like a mountain cat, down the slope toward the dry creek. Shadows wrapped around him, giving cover. When he reached her side, he dropped to one knee. Lark's skin was hot to the touch despite the cooling air. Her pulse fluttered weak beneath his fingers. He pulled the cork from his canteen, lifting her head gently, letting a few drops of water wet her tongue. Her eyes fluttered open, pupils wide in the dim light. A broken word slipped from her lips, water. Zane gave her another sip, careful, controlled. He wiped the dust and blood from her face with a damp cloth, his movement steady, almost tender. "Please," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. "Untie me." Zane's gaze lifted to the ridge. Vern and Hank were still hunched over their game, firelight flickering at their backs. Any wrong move, and the woman's suffering would end with bullets. "You're in bad shape," he muttered, his voice rough, a mix of warning and pity. "Another day of this will kill you." "I know." Her eyes locked with his, fierce despite the weakness in her body. "But I'm innocent." The words cut through him like a spur digging into flesh. He studied her face, the bruises, the grit, the raw rope burns. But beneath it all was something unyielding, a dignity he recognized. And in that moment, Zane Donovan, solitary rancher, broken widower, man of the mountain, felt the stirrings of a purpose he thought he'd buried with his family. The desert had stripped her near to death. But it had also stripped away his excuses. The desert always went silent before a storm, and that night the storm was in Zane's chest. The sun had gone, leaving the land draped in shadows and cold, the kind that slid into your bones and made teeth chatter. But it wasn't the cold that made his hands tremble as he crouched beside the staked woman. It was the weight of the choice pressing down on him. Lark's voice was little more than a rasp, but it carried the stubborn edge of someone who'd refused to surrender. "Untie me," she whispered again. Zane looked up toward the ridge. The Blackburn brothers' fire flickered like a devil's lantern, their laughter rising and falling with the shuffle of cards. They were drunk, careless, but not blind. A wrong move and the desert floor would be littered with more blood than the coyotes could carry off. Still, when he met Lark's eyes, dark, fierce, unbroken even in ruin, something inside him gave way. He thought of Faye's proud gaze, of Rose's innocent smile. The resemblance was no longer just in his head. It lived in her spirit. He slid the knife from his boot. The blade caught the moonlight for a fleeting second before biting into the ropes. Each cut was slow, steady, precise. The hemp fibers snapped one by one, leaving raw welts carved deep into her skin. Lark winced but didn't cry out. Her teeth clenched, jaw trembling, but her silence was iron. When the last rope fell free, she tried to rise. Her muscles, stretched for hours under the sun's cruelty, betrayed her. She collapsed back into the dirt with a muffled gasp. Zane caught her shoulders, steadying her, whispering low. "Easy now. Take it slow. Your body's not ready." Her breathing was ragged, shallow, but her eyes still held fire. He pulled her gently upright, easing her against his chest. For the first time in 15 years, Zane felt something more than grief and survival. He felt purpose again. He draped his coat around her shoulders, shielding her from the night chill. Then his gaze caught on something that made his heart stop. A chain glimmered against her throat, half hidden in the torn fabric of her dress. Hanging from it was a small jade pendant, shaped like a cottonwood leaf. His breath caught hard. That necklace wasn't just familiar, it was impossible. He had commissioned it in Santa Fe himself, long ago, as a gift for Rose on her 10th birthday. "Where'd you get this?" His voice came hoarse, rough as gravel. Lark's hand went instinctively to the pendant, protective. "It was my mother's," she whispered. "The only thing I have of her. A family treasure." The words sliced through him sharper than any blade. His mind reeled, torn between disbelief and a hope so fierce it hurt. Could it be? Could this broken, half-dead woman be the child he buried in his heart 15 years ago? Before he could ask more, a shout ripped the night. Zane's head snapped up. On the ridge, Vern Blackburn stood pointing straight down at them, his voice echoing across the canyon. "Hey! They're loose!" Curses followed, boots pounding, rifles clattering as the Blackburns scrambled for their horses. Zane scooped Lark into his arms, her body frail but stubbornly alive. He half-carried, half-dragged her toward the juniper grove where his horse was tethered. The sound of pursuit grew louder, angry voices, the jingle of spurs, the crack of branches under hurried steps. "Hold on," he muttered, vaulting her onto the saddle. She swayed, nearly falling, but he swung up behind her, steadying her with one arm. The horse snorted, restless with the scent of danger. Zane dug his heels into its flanks. The animal bolted into the darkness, hoofs striking sparks off the stones. Behind them, Vern's furious shout split the night, followed by the thunder of horses in hot pursuit. The chase had begun. The night was a blur of pounding hooves and flying dust. The horse beneath Zane carried them hard across the open flats, its breath steaming in the cold air. Behind, the Blackburn brothers howled curses, rifles flashing in the moonlight. A bullet hissed past his ear, snapping a mesquite branch clean off. Hold on, Zane growled, tightening his arm around Lark as she slumped against him. She was weak, her body still trembling from the ordeal under the sun, but she clung to the saddle horn with iron will. The jade pendant at her throat swung with every jolt, catching the moonlight like a shard of memory stabbing at his heart. They thundered into a narrow arroyo where the canyon walls rose steep and jagged, cutting off the sound of their pursuers. Zane slowed the horse to a trot, listening. Only the echo of hoofbeats lingered, fading into silence. For now, they were alone. He reined up in the shadow of a cottonwood and helped Lark down. She staggered, her legs buckling, and he caught her before she hit the ground. Her skin was clammy, her breath ragged. He lowered her gently onto a flat rock near the trickle of a spring. "You're burning up," he muttered, uncorking his canteen and pressing it to her lips. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin. When she finished, she leaned back, eyes closed, chest heaving. For a long moment, only the sound of the night crickets filled the canyon. Then, softly, she began to hum. Zane froze. The tune was faint, halting, but unmistakable. A lullaby. The same song Faye used to sing to Rose, back when laughter filled their homestead instead of silence. His throat tightened, memories clawing their way out of the dark corner he'd locked them in. "Where'd you learn that?" His voice came out rough, sharper than he meant. Lark opened her eyes. They glistened in the moonlight, fierce but weary. "My mother," she whispered. "I don't remember her face. Just her voice. Just that song." Zane felt his chest cave in. The pendant. The song. The fire in her eyes. It was too much to be chance. Yet the thought was almost unbearable. He had mourned Rose for 15 years, buried her in his heart alongside Faye. To believe she was alive, it was hope sharpened to a knife's edge. He turned away, fists clenched, staring at the canyon walls as though they held answers. "You saved me," she said suddenly. Her voice was hoarse, but steady. "Why? You don't even know me." Zane swallowed hard, the desert air thick in his lungs. "Because I've seen too much death," he said finally. "Because I couldn't let Grimm's kind of justice take another soul." Her gaze lingered on him, searching, probing, like she could peel back his weathered exterior and see the man still bleeding underneath. "Grimm," she spat the name with venom. "He's the one who ordered the raid. Years ago. I was just a child. I remember fire. Screams. A man in black, his eyes cold as stone. Her hands trembled as she touched the pendant. They said I was lucky to survive. But I don't feel lucky. I feel stolen." The words punched the air from Zane's lungs. He turned back, studying her face with a desperate intensity. She looked away, ashamed of her own tears. Before he could speak, a distant coyote's howl carried through the night. Zane stiffened. The Blackbuns weren't far, they'd circle back soon enough. He needed to move her, needed to keep her safe. He helped her onto her feet, steadier this time, though her frame still shook. His voice softened, stripped of its usual gravel. "Rest's over. We've got to keep moving. But listen to me," he paused, the weight of the next words pressing down on him like a mountain. "Whatever happens, you're not alone anymore." For the first time since the fire stole his world, Zane meant it. And though the night pressed cold around them, a faint warmth stirred in his chest. But in the darkness of Copper Springs, Judge Grimm's shadow stretched long. And it was only a matter of time before it found them again. The canyon walls gave way to rolling plains, pale beneath the fading stars. Zane rode with Lark cradled against him, her breathing shallow but steadier than before. The trail east wound through grassland still silvered with night dew, and with every hoofbeat, he felt the weight of time pressing heavier on his shoulders. By dawn, a lone cabin came into view, smoke curling weakly from its chimney. The sight stirred something like memory in Zane's chest. The place hadn't changed, rough-hewn logs, sagging porch, the old corral still leaning where it always had. It belonged to Jeb Carter, a man Zane hadn't seen in near a decade. Once, Jeb had been sheriff of Copper Springs. Now, like Zane, he lived on the edge of things, worn by battles he could never win. Zane reined in at the fence line and called out low. "Jeb." "It's Zane Donovan." The door creaked open, and a weathered figure stepped into the light. Jeb was broad but stooped, his hair gone white, his eyes sharp as a hawk's even in age. A rifle hung casually in his hands, though there was nothing casual about the way he held it. "Well, hell," Jeb said, his voice gravelly. "Thought you were long dead." His eyes shifted to the figure slumped against Zane. "And who's that you're dragging in like a sack of bones?" "Her name's Lark," Zane answered. "She needs rest. Water. Maybe more time than we got." Jeb studied them for a long, cold moment, then lowered the rifle. "Bring her in." Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and leather, with maps and old wanted posters curling yellow on the walls. Jeb laid out a blanket near the hearth, and Zane eased Lark down. She blinked awake, her gaze wary, but Jeb only grunted and handed her a tin cup of water. "She's Apache," Jeb said flatly. "That'll bring trouble fast, Zane. Especially with Grim pulling the strings these days." "I know," Zane muttered. His jaw tightened. "That's why I came." Jeb leaned against the mantel, rifle resting by his side, and sighed. "You always had a way of stepping into fire." His gaze lingered on Zane. "Grim's worse now. He's running Copper Springs like his own kingdom. Son-in-law, bounties, bribes, half the town's too scared or too greedy to stand against him." Zane's fists clenched. "I saw what he tried to do to her. It wasn't justice. It was murder dressed up in law." Jeb's eyes narrowed. "You think I don't know? I stepped down when I couldn't stomach his brand of order anymore. But that man's reach, it's long, Zane. He won't just let this go." The fire popped in the hearth, filling the silence. Lark's voice broke it, soft but steady. "Grim was there, when my village burned. I remember his face." Both men turned to her. Zane's chest ached at the words, but Jeb only shook his head grimly. "Then you're not just a prisoner who slipped the rope. You're a witness. And that makes you twice as dangerous." He poured himself a shot of whiskey, drank it in one pull, then slammed the glass down. "Listen, Zane. If you're set on crossing Grim, you'd better be ready for a war. Vern and Hank won't stop till they've got your hides. And Grim's got half the county eating out of his hand." Zane stood, his shadow stretching long in the firelight. His voice came low, steady, carrying the weight of years. "I've already been through hell, Jeb. Lost everything a man can lose. If there's a war coming, I'll meet it head-on. But this time, I won't be standing alone." His gaze drifted back to Lark, lying weak but unyielding, the jade pendant gleaming faintly at her throat. Something in his heart told him he had more to fight for now than he had in 15 years. Jeb exhaled, shaking his head. "Damn fool," he muttered. But there was a glimmer in his eyes, half respect, half sorrow. "All right. If you're set on this path, you'll have my rifle for as long as it matters. But don't say I didn't warn you." The three of them sat in silence, the fire crackling, the storm gathering. And outside, the prairie wind carried the faint echo of hoofbeats, Grim's men already hunting. By the second night, Jeb's old nag carried them east across the open prairie, the moon hanging low like a tarnished coin. Zane rode point, every sense alert. Behind him, Lark leaned against the saddle horn, wrapped in his coat, her strength coming back in small sparks. Jeb brought up the rear, his rifle across his lap, the weight of his years slowing neither his eyes nor his trigger finger. Their destination was a lonely stage stop run by May, a widow who'd buried more than her share of loved ones. Zane remembered her kindness from years past, when he'd still been a husband, a father, and a man who believed the world could be just. May was tough, with a heart like iron, and her place was one of the few left that Grimm hadn't poisoned completely. The stage station rose from the plain like a tired sentinel, weathered clapboard walls, lantern light flickering through warped windows, and a corral where mules shifted restlessly in the dark. The three of them slipped into the yard quiet, the crunch of gravel loud in the silence. May stepped out with a lantern, the light catching the silver streaks in her hair. Her shotgun rested easy in her hands, though her eyes softened when she recognized Zane. "Well, I'll be," she said, voice low and steady. "If it isn't Zane Donovan. Thought you were buried under that mountain of yours." Zane tipped his hat. "Still breathing, May. But not by much." He nodded toward Lark. "She needs shelter. Just for a spell." May studied Lark, the bruises, the Apache blood that marked her. Then she looked back at Zane. Something passed in her eyes, pity, maybe, but also steel. "Bring her in," she said. Inside, the smell of coffee and wood smoke filled the room. May laid out a cot by the stove, where Lark sank down with a sigh. Jeb poured himself coffee, muttering about his bones. For a brief moment, the place felt safe, wrapped in the warmth of the fire and May's quiet care. But safety in Copper Springs was a lie, and it didn't last. Near dawn, a rider thundered into the yard, breathless and shouting. He carried a handbill fresh from Grimm's men. May spread it on the table, her mouth set in a grim line. The words hit like a hammer. "Wanted, Zane Donovan and one Apache female, guilty of murder and treason. Reward, $500 alive. $200 dead." Zane's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Jeb cursed low. May slammed her fist against the wood. "They're saying you killed me," Jeb growled, slapping the page with a weathered hand. His eyes burned. "That's Grimm's trick. Twist the truth till it screams." Zane's chest felt hollow, but anger surged hot through his veins. Grimm wasn't just hunting them, he was rewriting the story, turning them into villains while he played the righteous lawman. May looked at Zane, her face lined with sorrow and rage. "The whole territory will be after you now. Every drifter, every hired gun. $500 will buy a man's silence, his soul, his bullets. You've got a storm on your heels, Zane." Before he could answer, the yard erupted with hoofbeats. Shadows of mounted men flickered past the windows, voices rough with violence. Vern and Hank had found them. The first rifle shot cracked through the glass, sending shards across the room. May ducked, dragging Lark from the cot. Jeb was already at the door, firing back with steady, deadly rhythm. Zane grabbed his Winchester, every muscle taut, every nerve alive. Outside, the world had narrowed to dust, smoke, and fury. Bullets tore splinters from the doorframe, the acrid stink of gunpowder filling the air. The Blackburns shouted curses, their men fanning out, surrounding the station like wolves circling prey. Zane pressed his shoulder to the wall, eyes sharp, heart pounding. For years he'd lived in silence, nursing his grief. But now the fight had come to him, dragging the ghosts of his past into firelight. And he knew this much: if Grimm wanted war, then war was what he'd get. The stage stop smoked with gunpowder and splintered wood. By dawn, the Blackburns had pulled back, leaving 2 of their riders sprawled in the dirt, and the rest scattering like coyotes driven from a carcass. Zane, Jeb, and May stood in the silence after, each breath ragged, each hand still clutching hot steel. Lark sat by the stove, shaken but alive, the faint glow of defiance still burning in her eyes. Zane wiped the sweat and grime from his face, his jaw tight. He knew this was just the beginning. Grimm would keep coming, and each time he'd bring more guns, more lies, more fury. That's when the door creaked open. For a heartbeat, every rifle in the room swung toward the figure in the doorway. A tall man stepped inside, thin as a fence post, his coat dust-stained, his eyes bright with the restless fire of someone who lived more with ink than bullets. He carried a leather satchel, heavy with papers, and a revolver that looked like it hadn't been fired in years. "Easy, friends," he said, his voice quick and steady. "Name's Rhett Dawson. I've come a long way to find you." Zane narrowed his eyes. "And what in hell do you want with us?" Rhett set the satchel on May's table and loosened the straps. "Truth," he said simply. "The kind that gets men killed, and saves others." He laid out several crumpled pages, telegrams, notes, signed orders with Grimm's name scratched bold across the lines. "Grimm's empire isn't built on law. It's built on blood. And I can prove it." May leaned closer, her brow furrowed. "What is this?" "Records," Rhett replied. "From Copper Springs Courthouse. Documents Grimm buried. A shipment ledger showing payments to bounty hunters. And this," he held up a yellow telegram, the paper thin as onion skin. 15 years ago. It was sent to Grimm the night your ranch burned, Donovan." Zane's stomach turned to stone. "Read it." Rhett unfolded it carefully, his voice dropping low. "Willow song eliminated. Child acquired. Orders fulfilled. Signed, Rusk." The room went silent but for the crackle of the stove. Zane gripped the table's edge so hard the wood groaned. The words blurred in front of him, swallowed by the rush of blood pounding in his ears. "Faye, murdered on Grimm's order. Rose, taken, not lost." His eyes flicked to Lark. She clutched the pendant at her throat, tears streaking the dust on her cheeks. Her lips moved but no sound came, as though the world itself had split beneath her feet. Jeb swore low, his weathered face grim. "God Almighty. He stole her life. Stole both your lives." Zane staggered back, a storm inside him, grief and rage tangled so fierce he could hardly breathe. For 15 years, he'd lived like a ghost. And all along, the devil who took everything still strutted through Copper Springs, cloaked in law and power. Rhett's gaze cut through the haze. "This is more than vengeance, Donovan. With these papers, with her testimony," he nodded at Lark. "We can drag Grimm before a federal judge. Strip him of the power he's bled this land with." May shook her head. "And how do you expect to get that far? Every bounty hunter between here and Santa Fe will be chasing their hides by sundown." Rhett's jaw set. "Then we outrun them. Outfight them if we have to. But if we don't try, Grimm wins forever." The fire crackled, throwing shadows across Zane's weathered face. He looked at Lark, no, Rose, and saw not just the child he'd lost, but the woman who had endured, scarred but unbroken. He straightened, the weight of grief sharpening into resolve. "All right," he said, voice low and hard. "We ride for Santa Fe. We take this truth to Judge Gage himself. And if Grimm wants to stop us," he chambered a round into his Winchester, the click loud in the stillness. "He'll have to finish what he started." Jeb nodded slowly. May lifted her shotgun. Rhett gathered his papers. And in the corner, Lark, Rose, raised her chin, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "Then let's end this." The morning sun bled gold across the prairie as the riders pushed east, their shadows long and lean on the open ground. Zane led the way, his jaw tight, his eyes never resting on one place too long. Beside him, Lark sat straighter than she had in days, her bruises fading but her spirit unbroken, the jade pendant catching glints of light with each step of her horse. Behind them, Jeb's rifle lay steady across his saddle horn, May's eyes scanned the ridgeline, and Rhett clutched his satchel as though it were a holy book. Saul and his daughter Iris rode close, their presence quiet but solid, every bit as sharp as the steel at their sides. The trail funneled into a ravine, narrow and steep-walled, red stone rising like broken teeth. Zane slowed his horse, a sour taste twisting in his gut. He'd ridden too many years not to feel when death was near. "Hold," he murmured, raising a hand. That was when hell opened up. Gunfire cracked from the cliffs. Bullets sparked off stone, a horse screamed, and dust filled the air. Voices whooped and cursed above. From the ledges, Vern Blackburn stood tall, his rage a fire that nearly scorched the rock itself. Beside him crouched his brother Hank, and flanking them was Ford, a scarred drifter with eyes like cold iron, another of Grimm's killers. Donovan. Vern's voice echoed like thunder. You're finished. Hand over the girl and them papers, or I'll salt this canyon with your bones. Zane swung down, pulling Lark with him behind cover. His Winchester came up smooth, his weathered hand steady as stone. Jeb rolled off his horse, returning fire in sharp, deliberate cracks. May's shotgun roared, the blast rattling the canyon walls. Saul and Iris found a ledge of rock, their rifles answering shot for shot. Rhett scrambled, clutching his satchel to his chest, papers fluttering in the grit. Hank moved first, sliding down the slope, his rifle aimed square at Rhett's back. But before his finger could squeeze, May's shotgun thundered again. Hank jerked, stumbled, then tumbled lifeless into the dirt. Ford snarled, his face twisted with rage. He fired wild, bullets chipping stone near Zane's head. Iris, young but unshaken, took her breath slow, her father's rifle pressed firm against her shoulder. She squeezed once. Ford staggered, eyes wide, before dropping into the dust. That left Vern. The canyon fell into a grim silence, broken only by Vern's ragged shout. You think this ends with me, Donovan? Grim owns this land. You're nothing but a dead man walking. Zane stepped from cover, his eyes locked on Vern. For 15 years he had lived in shadows, haunted by the fire that took his wife and child. For 15 years, men like Vern had hunted and killed without fear. But not anymore. Vern's revolver came up, his arm steady, hate burning in his eyes. Zane raised his Winchester, his voice cutting low, cold as iron. This ends now. The rifle cracked. The echo rolled down the ravine like thunder. Vern stumbled, disbelief etched on his face, before crumpling into the dust beside his brother. The smoke drifted away, leaving only silence and the acrid sting of gunpowder. The Blackburn brothers were finished. Grimm's pack of hounds had been broken. Zane lowered his rifle, chest heaving, his weathered face unreadable. Lark stood beside him, eyes wide, her hand gripping his sleeve. He glanced at her, and for a flicker of a moment, the fire inside him softened. Jeb spat into the dirt, reloading slow. One storm passed. Plenty more on the horizon. Rhett bent to gather his scattered papers, his hands trembling. May steadied him with a touch, her voice sharp but kind. Then we'd best ride before the next wave finds us. Saul and Iris stood watchful, their eyes hard. Zane looked back at the bodies sprawled in the canyon dust. For years, he had carried the weight of ghosts. Now, one burden had lifted, but a heavier one still pressed on his chest. Grimm was waiting. And Santa Fe was still a long, bloody road ahead. The canyon lay behind them, littered with bodies and the acrid stench of gunpowder. Zane led the way out, his Winchester across the saddle, his face carved in stone. Vern Blackburn was gone, just as delivered by Zane's own hand, but the fire in his chest burned hotter than ever. Grimm still ruled, and the road to Santa Fe was long. By dusk, lantern light shimmered from the lowlands ahead. Saul's ranch spread wide against the twilight, corrals full of restless cattle, a porch light glowing steady in the deepening dark. For the first time in days, the riders let themselves breathe. Saul greeted them with a firm clasp of Zane's shoulder, his voice solemn. You're carrying more than just yourselves. Come inside. The ranch house smelled of beans, leather, and old wood. Iris stoked the fire while May brewed coffee. Lark sank into a chair, shoulders slumped but eyes bright with something fierce. Rhett laid his satchel on the table, pulling out the papers he'd saved from the ambush. The stack looked battered, but the truth it held was alive. they weren't alone. Another rider had arrived ahead of them, York, a broad man with sunburned skin and weary eyes. He nodded to Zane, then placed a packet of folded letters on the table. "Been holding onto these near 10 years, York said, his voice rough. "Didn't have the guts to share them. Not till now. They're from folks Grimm silenced. Families burned out of their land. I kept 'em hid, prayin' maybe one day someone come along with the grit to use 'em." Rhett's hands trembled as he spread the letters, his eyes wide. This ties every raid to Grimm. Names. Places. Dates. His voice cracked with awe. "It's enough to bury him." Zane's jaw tightened. "If we can live long enough to deliver it." From the corner came a rasping voice, low and ancient. Ora, a bent Apache elder wrapped in a faded blanket, stepped forward from the shadows. Her eyes gleamed like embers in the firelight. She looked at Lark, no, Rose, and began to hum a tune. It was soft, haunting, a lullaby spoken in her people's tongue. Lark froze. Her lips parted, and without thinking, she finished the song. The words tumbled from her like water breaking through stone, her voice trembling yet sure. Tears welled in Ora's eyes. "You are Rose," she whispered, her voice cracked with both sorrow and wonder. "The daughter of Faye. Stolen in the fire. Hidden all these years." The room fell still. Zane's throat ached, his vision blurring as he stared at Lark. For 15 years he had carried her as a ghost in his heart. Now here she was, flesh and blood, singing the same song her mother once did. Lark's hand moved to the jade pendant at her throat. Her voice broke but held firm. "I thought I was nothing. Just a lost child no one claimed. But I am hers. I am yours." Her eyes found Zane's. "And I'll see Grimm fall for what he did to us." Zane reached for her hand, calloused fingers wrapping around hers, rough and steady. His chest trembled with the weight of grief, pride, and something like salvation. York leaned forward, voice gravelly. "Judge Gage in Santa Fe is the only one won't bow to Grimm. Get these papers to him, with her testimony, and the man's finished." Saul's eyes hardened. "Then we ride at first light. We won't get another chance." Jeb poured himself a measure of whiskey, his hand steady despite the years. "Grimm'll throw the whole territory at us before we reach that courthouse. But I reckon it's time someone made the bastard bleed." May checked her shotgun, Iris cradled her rifle. Rhett gathered the letters and telegrams into one neat bundle, the truth bound tight in his hands. Zane stood, taller than the firelight, his face shadowed but resolute. "We ride for Santa Fe. If Grimm wants to stop us, he'll have to finish what he started." Lark, Rose beside him, her chin high, her voice clear. "Then let's end this." The fire crackled, throwing sparks into the night. Outside, the wind carried the smell of sage and dust. Tomorrow would bring blood, trial, and truth. And this time, Zane Donovan wouldn't be facing it alone. Santa Fe rose from the desert like a city of clay and smoke, its adobe walls glowing under the harsh morning sun. The plaza buzzed with whispers. Bounty posters still clung to wooden posts, marking Zane Donovan and the Apache girl as murderers worth $500. Faces turned as the riders came through, dust-worn, battered, but unyielding. At the courthouse steps stood Judge Gage, tall and solemn in his black coat, federal marshals flanking him. And across from him, as if he owned the very earth, stood Judge Grimm. His silver beard caught the light, but his eyes were cold knives. Behind him lingered the last of his men, paid guns itching for blood. Zane swung down from his horse, boots striking hard against the dirt. His eyes never left Grimm. Lark, Rose, stood at his side, her chin lifted, the jade pendant glowing faintly against her throat. Behind them, Jeb, May, Saul, Iris, and York formed a line, every weapon ready. Rhett carried his satchel of papers tight to his chest. Aura, stooped but steady, leaned on her cane, her presence quiet but powerful. Grimm's voice cut through the square, slick as oil. This man's a murderer. This girl's a savage. Their friends are traitors. Bring them down. But Rhett was already stepping forward, spreading the letters, telegrams, and ledgers across Judge Gage's bench. His voice rang clear, shaking but strong. These are proof. Bribes, false trials, murders. Here, Grimm's own order. Willow's song eliminated. Child acquired. He stole this girl from her family, burned her village, and has ruled with blood ever since. A gasp rippled through the crowd. York stepped forward, holding out the letters he had hidden all those years. And these are from the people who survived his fire. Families who lost everything. I kept them hid, but no more. Aura's voice broke the hush, raw and solemn. This girl is Rose, daughter of Fae. I know her blood. I know her song. Grimm stole her. Now she is found. Judge Gage's eyes hardened as he turned on Grimm. But the old vulture snarled, pulling his revolver. Gunfire exploded. Grimm's men opened up, bullets slicing through the air. The marshals returned fire. Jeb's rifle cracked steady, May's shotgun thundered, Saul and Iris flanked with deadly aim. Rhett ducked low, shielding the papers with his body. Through the smoke, Grimm charged with a knife, his face twisted with hate. He lunged not for Zane, but for Lark. Zane moved faster than thought. His Colt roared once, then again. The first shot tore through Grimm's arm, the second slammed him to the ground. Dust rose as the tyrant fell, his knife skittering across the plaza. Zane strode forward, his shadow long in the sunlight. He pressed the barrel of his Colt to Grimm's chest. His voice came low, carved from grief and fire. You stole my daughter. You burned my life. This ends with me. Judge Gage raised a hand. Alive, Donovan. The law will hang him. For a long breath, Zane's finger trembled on the trigger. But then he holstered the Colt, his weathered face set like stone. Let the rope do the talking. The marshals dragged Grimm away, his curses breaking into silence. The square was quiet now, the people watching with wide eyes. The posters on the walls fluttered in the wind, already worthless lies. Zane turned. Rose stood there, tears cutting lines in the dust on her face. She reached for his hand. For 15 years, he'd carried only ghosts. Now, at last, he felt the weight of flesh, blood, and hope. The past could never be mended clean. But the future was theirs to fight for. The crowd began to disperse, whispers spreading like fire through dry grass. Saul and Iris stood proud, Jeb lit a cigar with hands steady as iron, May leaned her shotgun against her shoulder, and Rhett gathered his papers, knowing the truth would finally be written. Zane and Rose stood at the center of it all, father and daughter, scarred but unbroken, facing whatever came next.